Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing chapters of American ecclesiastical history. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed Saint Augustin Chapel, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? What time is it where you're watching this? Are you alone? Tell us in the comments. There's something about sharing these moments that makes us feel less isolated when confronting the depths of human depravity. The year was 1891. Deep in the bayous of southern Louisiana, where the cypress trees grew thick and the morning mist never fully lifted, there existed a place that locals called Marais Noir, the Black Marsh. It was a community of perhaps 200 souls, predominantly Cajun families who had lived there for generations, descended from Acadian exiles who had found refuge in these inhospitable wetlands over a century before. At the heart of Marais Noir stood Saint Augustin Chapel, a modest wooden structure built in 1868, just 3 years after the Civil War had torn the nation apart. The chapel served as the spiritual center for these isolated people, a beacon of faith in a landscape that seemed designed by nature to test that very faith. And for 22 years, that chapel had been tended by one man, Father Matthias Corbeau. Father Corbeau was 42 years old in the autumn of 1891. He had arrived at Saint Augustin as a young priest of 20, fresh from seminary in New Orleans, eager to serve God in whatever capacity the church deemed appropriate. What no one could have known then was that this remote posting would become the stage for acts so profane, so utterly incomprehensible, that they would challenge everything the community believed about sanctity, about trust, about the very nature of evil itself. On October 14, 1891, Bishop Etienne Roussel of the Diocese of New Orleans made an unannounced canonical inspection of Saint Augustin Chapel. Such inspections were routine, if infrequent, given the remote locations of many Louisiana parishes. The bishop arrived by boat, accompanied by 2 diocesan officials and a local guide. What he discovered beneath the altar of that small chapel would become one of the most scandalous cases in American Catholic history. But to understand the true horror of what Bishop Roussel found that day, we must go back. Back to the early months of 1891, when a young woman named Céleste Duval walked into Saint Augustin Chapel for confession and never walked out again. Back to the years before that, when other young women had vanished from Marais Noir without explanation. Back to the moment when Father Matthias Corbeau's devotion to God became something else entirely, something that had no name in any theology, something that could only be called madness. This is the story of the bride beneath the church. This is the story of what happens when isolation and obsession merge in a place where no one is watching, where the only witness is God himself, and where even that might not be enough. To comprehend the events at Saint Augustin Chapel, one must first understand the world in which they occurred. Louisiana in the late 19th century was a place still recovering from the catastrophic wounds of the Civil War and the turbulent years of Reconstruction that followed. The state's economy had been devastated, its social structures upended, and in remote areas like Marais Noir, the reach of law and governmental authority was tenuous at best. The community of Marais Noir existed in profound isolation, located approximately 40 miles south of New Orleans, accessible only by a network of waterways that twisted through dense swampland. It might as well have been on another continent. The nearest town of any substantial size was La Fourche, a day's journey by boat under favorable conditions. During the wet season, which lasted from May through October, Marais Noir was often completely cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. The people of Marais Noir were predominantly French-speaking Cajuns, descendants of the Acadians who had been expelled from Nova Scotia by the British in the 1750s. They had preserved their language, their customs, and their Catholic faith with remarkable tenacity. The church was not merely a religious institution for these people. It was the primary tie that bound their community together, the keeper of records, the arbiter of disputes, the voice of moral authority in a place where no other authority existed. Father Matthias Corbeau had been born in New Orleans in 1849, the son of a French merchant and a Creole mother. Little is known about his early life, but diocesan records indicate he entered seminary at the age of 16, which was young even for that era. His superiors noted that he was exceptionally devout, perhaps too much so. One evaluation from 1868 describes him as possessing a fervor that borders on the excessive and a tendency towards solitary prayer that suggests discomfort with the communal aspects of religious life. Nevertheless, Corbeau was ordained in 1869 and assigned to Saint Augustin Chapel later that same year. At the time, the posting was considered a hardship. The previous priest had died of yellow fever, and finding a replacement willing to serve in such isolation proved difficult. Corbeau, however, accepted the assignment with what witnesses described as unsettling enthusiasm. The chapel itself was a simple structure, built of cypress wood that had been harvested from the surrounding swamps. It measured approximately 30 feet by 50 feet, with a small bell tower and a modest sacristy attached to the rear. The interior could accommodate perhaps 100 worshippers at capacity. The altar was made of local stone, topped with a wooden tabernacle that Corbeau himself had carved during his early years at the chapel. What no one knew, what no one had any reason to suspect, was that Father Corbeau had also made other modifications to the chapel. Beneath the stone altar, accessible through a concealed trap-door in the sacristy floor, he had excavated a chamber. The soil in that part of Louisiana was soft, composed mainly of river silt and decayed vegetation. With patience and secrecy, working only at night, he had created a space approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, roughly 6 feet deep. Historical. Records from Marais Noir are fragmentary at best. The community kept no formal census, no systematic documentation of births and deaths beyond what the church itself recorded. But in examining baptismal and burial records from Saint Augustin, a disturbing pattern emerges. Between 1873 and 1891, at least 7 young women between the ages of 16 and 23 were reported missing from Marais Noir and the surrounding settlements. In each case, the circumstances were similar. The young woman would be seen entering the chapel, usually in the late afternoon or evening. Father Corbeau would later report that they had come for confession or spiritual counseling, that they had left the chapel after their conversation, and that he had no knowledge of what became of them afterward. Given the dangerous nature of the swampland surrounding Marais Noir, where sinkholes, quicksand, and alligators posed constant threats, the disappearances were generally attributed to tragic accidents. No one suspected the priest. How could they? He was their spiritual shepherd, the representative of God in their isolated community. He baptized their children, heard their confessions, administered the sacraments to their dying. He lived a life of apparent celibacy and devotion, spending long hours in prayer, maintaining the chapel with meticulous care, tending a small garden where he grew vegetables and flowers. But Father Corbeau had another occupation, one that consumed him in the darkness. He had become a student of death, of preservation, of the chemical processes by which the body might be prevented from returning to dust. In letters later discovered among his possessions, he corresponded with undertakers in New Orleans, asking detailed questions about embalming techniques, about the chemicals used to arrest decay, about the methods by which the dead might be made to appear as if they were merely sleeping. The people of Marais Noir noticed that Father Corbeau frequently ordered supplies from New Orleans, chemicals, they assumed, for developing photographs, which had become a hobby of his. Large quantities of linen, which he claimed were needed for altar cloths and vestments. Flowers, even during seasons when nothing bloomed naturally in the swamps, which he said were necessary for decorating the chapel for various feast days. All of it was true, and all of it was lies. The case that would ultimately expose Father Corbeau began, as these things so often do, with a single person who asked questions when everyone else had accepted convenient explanations. That person was Marie-Claire Duval, mother of 19-year-old Celeste. Celeste Duval was described by those who knew her as exceptionally beautiful, with dark hair and pale skin that seemed luminous in the perpetual twilight of the swamps. She was devout, attending Mass faithfully, and had expressed interest in joining a religious order. In the spring of 1891, she had begun meeting regularly with Father Corbeau for spiritual direction, discussing her possible vocation. On the evening of June 23, 1891, Celeste told her mother she was going to the chapel for confession. It was a Tuesday, and Father Corbeau was known to hear confessions on Tuesday and Friday evenings. Celeste left her family's cabin at approximately 6 o'clock. She never returned. Marie-Claire raised the alarm the following morning. A search party was organized, combing the pathways between the Duval cabin and Saint Augustin Chapel, dragging the nearby waterways, examining the treacherous ground for any sign of what might have happened. Father Corbeau participated in the search, appearing genuinely distressed. He confirmed that Celeste had come for confession, that he had heard her confession and given her absolution, and that she had left the chapel at approximately 7 o'clock, just as the sun was setting. But Marie-Claire was not satisfied. Something in Father Corbeau's manner troubled her, though she could not articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the way his eyes never quite met hers when he spoke of Celeste. Perhaps it was the excessive detail of his account, as if he had rehearsed it. Or perhaps it was simply a mother's instinct, that deep and primal knowledge that something was terribly wrong. She began asking questions. Had anyone else seen Celeste leave the chapel? No one had. Were there any signs of struggle along the path? There were not. Had Celeste seemed troubled or distressed in the days before her disappearance? On the contrary, she had seemed peaceful, almost joyful. Marie-Claire went to the chapel repeatedly, speaking with Father Corbeau, pressing him for any detail he might have forgotten. The priest was patient with her at first, then increasingly irritated. Finally, in late July, he told her bluntly that her persistent questioning was bordering on accusation, and that if she could not accept God's mysterious ways, perhaps she needed to examine her own faith. The rebuke silenced Marie-Claire, but it did not stop her suspicions. She began watching the chapel from a distance, noting Father Corbeau's habits. She observed that he often entered the chapel late at night, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. She noticed that he received shipments from New Orleans more frequently than seemed necessary for a small chapel in an isolated community. She detected on several occasions when she came to the chapel for Mass a strange chemical odor that she could not identify. In August, Marie-Claire shared her concerns with her husband, Jean-Baptiste Duval. He was skeptical at first. Accusing a priest was no small matter, particularly in a community where the church was the primary source of moral authority. But Marie-Claire was insistent, and her conviction eventually persuaded him to act. Jean-Baptiste wrote a letter to the Bishop of New Orleans, detailing his wife's concerns. The letter was carefully worded, presenting their suspicions as questions rather than accusations. Had the bishop heard of other disappearances in the diocese? Was Father Corbeau's behavior consistent with that of other priests in remote postings? Would the bishop consider conducting an inspection of Saint Augustin Chapel? The letter was sent in early September. For weeks, there was no response. The Duvals began to fear that their concerns had been dismissed, or worse, that they would face consequences for questioning a priest. But in early October, they received word that Bishop Roussel himself would be visiting Marais Noir to conduct a canonical inspection. Father Corbeau received similar notification. A letter from the diocesan office informed him that the bishop would be arriving on October 14th for a routine inspection of the chapel and its records. The inspection would include an examination of the physical structure of the chapel, a review of baptismal and burial records, and an interview with the priest regarding his ministry. What Father Corbeau did during the 10 days between receiving this notification and the bishop's arrival remains a matter of speculation. Some evidence suggests he considered fleeing. A boat owner in Marais Noir later testified that the priest had inquired about passage to New Orleans, though he ultimately did not book the journey. Other evidence suggests he spent those days in frantic activity within the chapel, the ish, sounds of movement and construction audible to nearby residents late into the night. Whatever preparations he made, they were not sufficient. On the morning of October 14th, Bishop Roussel arrived at Saint Augustin Chapel, accompanied by Father Henri Beaumont, a diocesan canon lawyer, and Father Thomas Murphy, a priest known for his expertise in church architecture and maintenance. The bishop's stated purpose was routine inspection, but those who saw him disembark from the boat noted an unusual severity in his expression. The inspection began with a review of the chapel's sacramental records. Father Corbeau produced the ledgers documenting baptisms, marriages, confirmations, and burials conducted during his tenure. The records appeared to be in order, meticulously maintained, though Father Beaumont would later note that several entries regarding the disappeared women included unusual details, descriptions of their physical appearance and spiritual state that seemed excessive for standard record-keeping. Next, the bishop examined the physical structure of the chapel. Father Murphy, with his trained eye for ecclesiastical architecture, inspected the building's foundations, its roof, its windows, and doors. It was Father Murphy who first noticed irregularities in the floor of the sacristy. The wooden planks, while appearing uniform, showed signs of having been repeatedly removed and replaced. The nails were new, inconsistent with a structure built over 20 years earlier. Tell us in the comments what you think was going through Father Corbeau's mind at this moment. Did he know his secret was about to be exposed? Was he preparing some explanation, some final, desperate lie? Or had some part of him wanted this day to come all along? Father Murphy knelt and examined the floorboards more closely. He noticed that one section, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, was not nailed as securely as the surrounding floor. When he applied pressure to one corner, the entire section shifted slightly. He looked up at Bishop Roussel. Without a word, the bishop nodded. What happened next would be recorded in sworn testimony given during both ecclesiastical and civil proceedings. Father Murphy pried up the loose section of flooring, revealing a wooden trapdoor beneath. The trapdoor had an iron ring for a handle. Father Beaumont produced a lantern, which he lit and held aloft as Father Murphy pulled open the trapdoor. The smell that emerged from below was described by all 3 men in identical terms: flowers, decay, and chemicals, a combination so overpowering that Father Beaumont staggered backward, nearly dropping the lantern. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. Bishop Roussel took the lantern from Father Beaumont's trembling hands and began to climb down. What the bishop saw in that underground chamber would haunt him until his death 30 years later. And it is here, at this moment of terrible revelation, that our story truly begins. The chamber beneath Saint Augustin Chapel measured approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling height of roughly 6 feet. The walls had been lined with wooden planks to prevent collapse, and the floor had been covered with tiles salvaged from a demolished building in New Orleans. The space was illuminated by oil lamps mounted on the walls, which Father Corbeau had apparently lit recently, as they still burned when the bishop descended. At the center of the chamber stood what could only be described as a marriage bed. It was a substantial piece of furniture, clearly constructed within the chamber itself, as it would have been impossible to maneuver through the trapdoor opening. The bed frame was made of carved wood, and Father Corbeau had lavished upon it the same craftsmanship he had displayed in his construction of the chapel's tabernacle. The headboard featured elaborate religious imagery, angels, roses, and intertwined rings symbolizing holy matrimony. Upon the bed, arranged as if she were merely sleeping, lay the body of Céleste Duval. She was dressed in a wedding gown of white linen, her hands folded across her chest in an attitude of prayer. Her face had been made up with cosmetics, rouge on her cheeks and lips, her hair arranged in an elaborate style and adorned with orange blossoms. Around her neck she wore a rosary of black beads, and on her finger was a gold ring. But Céleste Duval had not been sleeping peacefully in a marriage bed. She had been dead for nearly 4 months, and only Father Corbeau's extensive knowledge of embalming had preserved her body from the rapid decomposition that would have occurred naturally in Louisiana's humid climate. Bishop Roussel stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand. Behind him, Father Murphy descended the ladder, then immediately vomited upon seeing the scene before him. Father Beaumont, still standing above at the trapdoor, called down, asking what they had found. The bishop's response, recorded in his official report, was simply, "God have mercy on us all." The chamber contained much more than the bed and its occupant. Along one wall stood a makeshift altar, draped with white cloth and adorned with candles, crucifixes, and vases of fresh flowers. Upon this altar was an open missal, marked at the text of the nuptial mass. Beside the missal lay a stack of papers covered in handwriting that would later be identified as Father Corbeau's. On the opposite wall, Father Corbeau had created what could only be described as a shrine. Here were tacked numerous photographs, all of young women, some of the images professionally made, others obviously captured by Father Corbeau himself with equipment he had acquired for that purpose. Some of the women in the photographs were identified in later investigations, others remain unknown to this day, but among them, unmistakably, were images of at least 6 of the young women who had disappeared from Marais Noir over the previous 18 years. Beneath the photographs, carefully arranged in small wooden boxes, were what Bishop Roussel initially took to be relics of saints. Only upon closer examination did he realize that these were personal effects of the missing women: locks of hair tied with ribbons, jewelry, fragments of clothing, and in some cases items that suggested a far more sinister fate. In one box, wrapped in silk, were human finger bones, cleaned and preserved with the same care Father Corbeau had given to everything in this profane sanctuary. The air in the chamber was heavy with the scent of embalming fluid, primarily formaldehyde, which Father Corbeau had obtained through his correspondence with undertakers in New Orleans. On a small table near the bed stood an array of bottles containing various chemicals: carbolic acid, glycerin, alcohol, and others. There were also tools that one might expect to find in a mortuary: syringes, tubes, scalpels, and needles. Most disturbing of all was a wedding certificate, elaborately decorated and written in Latin, dated June 24, 1891, the day after Céleste Duval's disappearance. The certificate declared that on that date, in the presence of God and the angels, Father Matthias Corbeau had entered into holy matrimony with Céleste Marie Duval. Both signatures appeared on the document, though handwriting analysis would later confirm that both had been written by Father Corbeau himself. Bishop Roussel ordered Father Murphy to return to the surface and to bring the civil authorities immediately. He himself remained in the chamber, partly to ensure the preservation of evidence, but also because he seemed unable to move, unable to process the magnitude of sacrilege and depravity before him. Father Beaumont stood guard at the trapdoor, praying in a whisper that became increasingly frantic as the full implications of their discovery began to manifest. Where was Father Corbeau during all of this? That question would not be answered for several hours, and when it was, it would add yet another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible situation. While Father Murphy rowed by boat to summon the authorities from La Fourche, Father Beaumont made a systematic search of the chapel's sacristy. Among Father Corbeau's personal possessions, hidden in a locked trunk for which the bishop's authority compelled the breaking of the lock, were numerous journals dating back to 1870. These journals provided a window into the deterioration of Father Corbeau's mind, a descent that had been occurring slowly and inexorably for over 2 decades. The early entries were unremarkable, typical reflections of a young priest adjusting to the isolation of a remote posting. He wrote about his daily routines, his pastoral duties, his struggles with loneliness, and his fervent prayers for strength to serve God faithfully. But by 1872, subtle changes appeared in his writing. He began to describe visions, moments during Mass when he claimed to see angels surrounding the altar. He wrote of dreams in which God spoke to him directly, assuring him that he was chosen for a special purpose. He developed an elaborate theology around the concept of the celestial marriage, drawing on mystic traditions and distorting them to serve his emerging obsessions. In May of 1873, Father Corbeau wrote extensively about a young woman named Amélie Broussard, who had come to him for instruction in preparation for her first Holy Communion. He described her as possessing an otherworldly beauty, a purity that reminded him of the Virgin Mary herself. Over several weeks, his entries about Amélie became increasingly frequent and increasingly inappropriate. He wrote of how her presence made him feel closer to understanding the divine mystery of union with God. He described watching her pray, noting every detail of her appearance and manner. On July 12, 1873, Amélie Broussard disappeared after attending confession at Saint Augustin Chapel. Father Corbeau's journal entry from that date reads, in translation from his French, "Tonight, God has granted me the greatest blessing. My prayers have been answered. The celestial marriage has begun, and I am chosen to experience in the flesh what the mystics knew only in spirit. She is with me now, and she will be with me forever, uncorrupted by time, perfect in her purity, my bride before God." Subsequent entries make clear what had occurred. Amélie had died during her confession, Father Corbeau claimed. Whether from natural causes or by his hand was left ambiguous in his writing. But her death, rather than being treated as a tragedy, was described as a divine gift. Father Corbeau wrote that God had preserved her for him, had taken her life at the moment of her purest spiritual state so that she could be his eternal bride. He described in meticulous detail how he had prepared her body, teaching himself, embalming techniques through correspondence and experimentation. He wrote of constructing the hidden chamber, of creating the marriage bed, of conducting a private wedding ceremony in which he married her corpse according to what he believed were sacred rites. And he described his subsequent interactions with her body in terms that confirmed the accusations of necrophilia that would later be leveled against him. But Amélie was not enough. Father Corbeau's journals revealed that the preservation techniques available to him in the 1870s were crude, and despite his efforts, Amélie's body eventually succumbed to decay. He wrote of his anguish at losing her, of his prayers to God to send him another bride, and God, or so he believed, answered those prayers. Between 1873 and 1891, Father Corbeau's journals documented 6 additional celestial marriages. Each followed a similar pattern. A young woman would capture his attention, he would interpret his attraction as divine calling, and he would arrange circumstances that brought her into the chapel alone. In some cases, the young women may have died of natural causes, sudden illness or accident. In others, the journals strongly suggested he had administered poison, likely in the communion wine. What is most chilling about these journals is the complete absence of guilt or moral struggle. Father Corbeau never questioned whether his actions were wrong. He had constructed an elaborate theological framework that justified everything he did. He saw himself as a mystic, a chosen soul, privileged to experience a form of union with God that transcended conventional morality. The young women were not victims in his mind. They were blessed, granted the opportunity to serve as vehicles for his spiritual enlightenment. The final journal, begun shortly after Céleste Duval's death, was different in tone from the earlier volumes. Here, Father Corbeau wrote with increasing paranoia. He noted Marie-Claire Duval's persistent questions, her obvious suspicions. He wrote of his fear that he would be discovered before he could complete what he called the great work. He described elaborate plans for preserving Céleste's body indefinitely, perfecting his embalming techniques so that she would remain with him for years, decades, perhaps even beyond his own death. In his final entry, dated October 13, 1891, the day before Bishop Roussel's arrival, Father Corbeau wrote, "If they come tomorrow, they will not understand. How could they? They have not been chosen as I have been chosen. They have not experienced the divine mystery that has been revealed to me, but it does not matter. Céleste and I are united before God, and nothing on earth can separate us. In this life or the next, we are one." Father Corbeau was found in the chapel's bell tower approximately 3 hours after the discovery of the chamber. He had barricaded himself there, and when the civil authorities arrived from La Fourche, led by Sheriff Auguste Landry, they found him kneeling before a small altar he had constructed, praying with an intensity that witnesses described as terrifying. Sheriff Landry, accompanied by 2 deputies and Father Murphy, climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower. They could hear Father Corbeau's voice before they reached him, chanting in Latin, the words of the nuptial mass mingled with prayers of his own composition. When they emerged into the bell tower chamber, they found him completely unaware of their presence, lost in whatever spiritual realm he inhabited. It was Father Murphy who finally interrupted him, speaking in French, the language both priests shared from their seminary education. Father Corbeau turned slowly, and those who witnessed his expression would later struggle to describe it. There was no fear, no shame, no recognition that he had committed any wrong. Instead, he appeared almost beatific, as if he had achieved some transcendent state of grace. "You don't understand," were his first words to them. "You cannot understand." Sheriff Landry informed him that he was under arrest for multiple murders and desecration of human remains. Father Corbeau received this information with what appeared to be mild curiosity, as if they were discussing some abstract theological question rather than capital crimes. "Murders?" he said. "I have not committed murder. I have facilitated divine unions. I have been an instrument of God's will." The dialogue that followed was recorded by Father Murphy, who took notes despite his obvious distress. Father Corbeau spoke at length about his beliefs, his visions, his interpretation of mystical theology. He cited various saints and mystics who had experienced divine visions and ecstasies. He compared himself to Saint Francis receiving the stigmata, to Saint Teresa of Avila in her spiritual raptures, to medieval anchorites who had walled themselves up in churches to be closer to God. When confronted with the physical evidence of his crimes, the preserved bodies, the journals, the clear documentation of his necrophilic practices, Father Corbeau responded with a smile that chilled everyone present. "The flesh is merely a vessel," he said. "What I have done with these vessels is no different than what any priest does when he elevates the host during Mass. I have taken that which is earthly and transformed it into something divine." Sheriff Landry, a devout Catholic himself, was so disturbed by this comparison that he struck Father Corbeau across the face. It was the only moment during the arrest when Father Corbeau showed any emotional response, though it was not fear or pain, but rather a kind of satisfaction, as if he believed the blow confirmed that his persecutors could not understand his higher purpose. The descent from the bell tower was difficult. Father Corbeau refused to walk voluntarily, not out of resistance, but because he seemed to have lost all awareness of his physical circumstances. He had to be carried down the narrow stairs by the deputies, all the while continuing to recite prayers and fragments of mystical texts. As they emerged from the chapel, the community of Marais Noir had gathered. News of the discovery had spread quickly, and virtually every resident of the settlement had come to Saint Augustin. When they saw Father Corbeau, the man who had baptized their children, who had heard their confessions, who had seemed to be a pillar of righteousness in their isolated world, being carried out in custody, a collective wail went up from the crowd. But the wail turned to something else when Sheriff Landry announced what had been found beneath the chapel. Horror, rage, and a desperate need for vengeance swept through the assembled people. Several men rushed toward Father Corbeau with clear intent to harm him, and only the quick action of the deputies prevented a lynching then and there. Marie-Claire Duval was in that crowd when she learned that her daughter's body had been found, that for 4 months Celeste had been lying in that underground chamber while the mother had grieved and searched. Something in her broke. Her screams could be heard across the swamp, a sound of pure anguish that silenced even the angry mob. Father Corbeau was transported by boat to La Fourche that very evening, for his own safety as much as for justice. As the boat pulled away from the dock at Marais Noir, he turned back to look at Saint Augustin Chapel one final time. According to Father Murphy, who accompanied him, Father Corbeau's last words before leaving were, "I will return to her. In this life or the next, I will return to my bride." The chapel itself stood silent, its secret revealed, its sanctity forever violated. And beneath its altar, in that underground chamber, Bishop Roussel ordered that everything be left exactly as found, preserved as evidence for the trials that would follow. The legal and ecclesiastical proceedings following the arrest of Father Matthias Corbeau were complex and protracted, complicated by questions of jurisdiction, the influence of the Catholic Church, and the unprecedented nature of the crimes. The criminal trial began in March of 1892 in the parish seat at Thibodaux, Louisiana. Father Corbeau was charged with 7 counts of murder, 7 counts of abuse of a corpse, and numerous other offenses, including fraud and violation of his sacred duties. The trial attracted national attention, with newspaper reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago descending on the small Louisiana courthouse. Father Corbeau refused legal representation initially, insisting that he would defend himself and present what he called the mystical defense. He was eventually assigned counsel against his will, but he refused to cooperate with his attorneys. During the trial itself, he frequently interrupted proceedings to deliver lengthy speeches about divine revelation, mystical theology, and his belief that earthly law had no jurisdiction over actions taken in service to a higher power. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the journals, the physical evidence from the chamber, testimony from experts on embalming and forensic medicine, and statements from family members of the missing women. But the most damning evidence came from Father Corbeau himself. When finally allowed to testify, he provided detailed descriptions of each of his celestial marriages, explaining his methods and his beliefs with a clarity that left no doubt about his actions. The defense, such as it was, rested on a plea of insanity. Father Corbeau's attorneys argued that no sane person could believe the things he claimed to believe, that his years of isolation had produced a complete break from reality. Medical experts were called to examine him, and their conclusions were mixed. Some believed he was genuinely insane, unable to distinguish right from wrong. Others, however, testified that Father Corbeau showed no signs of the disorganized thinking typical of psychosis, that his delusions, while bizarre, were internally consistent and carefully reasoned. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The question of Father Corbeau's sanity was acknowledged but ultimately deemed irrelevant to the question of guilt. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for August 1st, 1892. But Father Matthias Corbeau would never face the hangman's noose. On the night of July 28, 1892, 3 days before his scheduled execution, Father Corbeau was found dead in his cell at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Baton Rouge. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, using strips of cloth torn from his bedding. However, the circumstances of his death raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered. The guard who discovered his body reported that Father Corbeau had arranged himself in a peculiar manner. Rather than the typical suicide by hanging, where the victim stands on an object and then kicks it away, Father Corbeau appeared to have strangled himself slowly while kneeling in a position of prayer. More disturbing still, he had used his own blood to write on the cell wall. The message in Latin read, "Mors non est finis, in aeternum sponsa mea." Death is not the end, forever my bride. Some observers at the time suggested that Father Corbeau's death was not suicide at all, but murder carried out by fellow prisoners or even guards who believed he deserved a more immediate justice than the legal system could provide. Others speculated that the Catholic Church, embarrassed by the scandal and eager to close the chapter, had arranged his death to prevent the additional publicity that a public execution would generate. The ecclesiastical trial proceeded even after Father Corbeau's death. The Church stripped him posthumously of his holy orders, declared his actions to be the gravest possible violations of canon law, and ordered that Saint Augustin Chapel be deconsecrated and demolished. However, the demolition order was never carried out. The chapel stood abandoned for decades, slowly consumed by the swamp, until it finally collapsed during a hurricane in 1927. The bodies of the 7 identified victims were returned to their families for proper burial. Céleste Duval was laid to rest in the cemetery at Marais Noir, her grave marked with a simple cross. The wedding gown in which Father Corbeau had dressed her was burned, and the ring he had placed on her finger was removed and destroyed. Marie-Claire Duval died less than a year after her daughter's burial, some said of a broken heart. But the story of the bride beneath the church did not end with Father Corbeau's death or with the proper burial of his victims. Over the subsequent decades, additional revelations emerged that suggested the full scope of his crimes might never be known. In 1912, 20 years after the trial, a former resident of Marais Noir named Etienne Chauvin published a memoir in which he claimed to have witnessed strange occurrences at Saint Augustin Chapel during his childhood in the 1880s. Chauvin wrote that he had once hidden in the chapel after evening mass, playing a game, when he saw Father Corbeau descend into the sacristy carrying what appeared to be a body wrapped in white cloth. Chauvin was only 8 years old at the time and had convinced himself he had imagined it, or that the priest was simply carrying supplies. But after the revelations of 1891, Chauvin came to believe he had witnessed one of Father Corbeau's victims being taken to the underground chamber. In 1934, during construction of a new road through what had once been Marais Noir, workers excavating near the site of the demolished chapel made a gruesome discovery. Approximately 50 feet from where the chapel had stood, buried in the soft swamp soil at a depth of 6 feet, they found a collection of wooden boxes. Inside these boxes were human remains, primarily skeletal, belonging to at least 4 individuals, all female, all adolescent or young adult. The remains were examined by forensic experts at Tulane University in New Orleans. While the condition of the bones made precise determination difficult, the UT experts concluded that the remains had been buried sometime between 1870 and 1890. The placement of the remains, carefully arranged in individual boxes, suggested deliberate burial rather than criminal disposal. Some investigators speculated that these might have been earlier victims of Father Corbeau, young women who had died before he developed his embalming techniques, or whose bodies he had eventually been forced to dispose of when preservation failed. However, the boxes also contained items that complicated this theory. Among the remains were religious medals, rosaries, and small prayer books, all carefully preserved. One box contained a letter, badly deteriorated but partially legible, written in French. The letter appeared to be from Father Corbeau to one of the deceased, expressing his grief at losing her and his prayers that they would be reunited in heaven. The tone of the letter was mournful rather than possessive, suggesting these early deaths might have affected him differently than his later crimes. In 1956, a graduate student in anthropology at Louisiana State University named Thomas Melanson wrote his doctoral dissertation on the Father Corbeau case. Melanson conducted extensive interviews with descendants of Marais Noir families and examined every available document related to the case. His research uncovered something that had been overlooked in the original investigations. Melanson discovered that Father Corbeau had made at least 3 trips to Mexico between 1885 and 1888. The purpose of these trips had never been explained, but Melanson found correspondence suggesting that Father Corbeau had traveled to study with practitioners of indigenous preservation techniques, specifically methods used by certain Mexican cultures to create naturally mummified remains. This finding suggested a level of premeditation and planning that made his crimes even more chilling. Perhaps most disturbing was Melanson's discovery of a cache of photographs in the archives of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. These photographs, taken by Father Corbeau himself, showed the interior of his underground chamber at various stages of its development. The earliest photographs dated to 1871, a full 2 years before the disappearance of Amélie Broussard, the first identified victim. This meant that Father Corbeau had been planning his crimes for years before he committed them, methodically creating the space and acquiring the knowledge he would need. In 1978, the last surviving person with direct memory of the events passed away. This was Joseph Landry, grandson of Sheriff Auguste Landry, who had arrested Father Corbeau. In an interview conducted shortly before his death, Joseph Landry, then 93 years old, recalled his grandfather's descriptions of entering the underground chamber. According to Joseph, his grandfather had been forever changed by what he saw that day, becoming withdrawn and prone to nightmares. Sheriff Landry had died in 1905, and on his deathbed, he told his grandson something he had never revealed publicly. According to Sheriff Landry's account, when they removed Celeste Duval's body from the chamber, they discovered that Father Corbeau had taken one final horrific action. Concealed beneath the wedding gown, over her heart, Father Corbeau had surgically implanted a small reliquary containing fragments of bone from his previous victims. In his mind, he had created a physical union between all of his celestial brides, binding them together in death as he believed they were bound in the eyes of God. This detail had been suppressed by both civil and ecclesiastical authorities, deemed too disturbing for public knowledge. But Sheriff Landry had carried it with him for 13 years, and he passed it to his grandson with the words, "Some things are too evil to forget, but too terrible to remember." Today, more than a century after the discovery of Father Matthias Corbeau's crimes, the site where Saint Augustin Chapel once stood is completely overgrown, indistinguishable from the surrounding swamp. The community of Marais Noir itself has long since been abandoned, its residents having gradually dispersed in the decades following the scandal. Where families once lived and worked, there is now only water, cypress trees, and the endless chorus of insects and frogs. But the questions raised by the case remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. How many victims were there really? The official count stands at 7 identified women, but the remains discovered in 1934 suggest at least 4 more. Were there others whose bodies were never found, who were disposed of in the depths of the swamp where they would never be recovered? The journals provide no definitive answer, and Father Corbeau took his secrets to the grave. What drove Father Matthias Corbeau to commit such acts? Was he truly insane, suffering from delusions that transformed his criminal desires into what he perceived as divine calling? Or was he something more sinister, a predator who constructed an elaborate theological justification for acts he knew were evil? The medical experts of his time could not agree, and modern psychologists studying the case remain divided. Some have suggested that Father Corbeau suffered from a condition that would today be recognized as erotomania with religious delusions, a rare psychiatric disorder in which the sufferer believes they are destined for a romantic relationship ordained by God. Others have argued that he was simply a necrophile who used religious language to rationalize his compulsions. Still, others have proposed that years of isolation and celibacy in the remote swamps of Louisiana produced a genuine break from reality, transforming religious devotion into something monstrous. There is also the question of institutional responsibility. Could the Catholic Church have prevented Father Corbeau's crimes if they had provided better oversight of their remote parishes? The Diocese of New Orleans conducted no regular inspections of Saint Augustin Chapel for over 20 years, leaving Father Corbeau essentially unsupervised. His superiors had noted his excessive devotion and his discomfort with community even before his ordination, yet they assigned him to one of the most isolated postings in the diocese. Should they bear some responsibility for what followed? The Church's response to these questions has been historically one of deflection and minimization. Official statements emphasized that Father Corbeau was a lone individual whose actions were completely inconsistent with Church teaching and practice. They pointed to the swift canonical trial and the removal of his holy orders as evidence of their commitment to justice. But critics have argued that the Church's primary concern was protecting its reputation, rather than examining the systemic factors that might have contributed to the tragedy. And what of the victims themselves? 7 young women, identified by name, whose lives were cut short and whose bodies were defiled in ways almost too terrible to contemplate. At least 4 more whose names we may never know. How many families were destroyed by grief? How many lives were forever altered by the revelation that the man they had trusted with their deepest secrets and their spiritual welfare was capable of such horrors? The descendants of Marais Noir, those who can still trace their lineage to that isolated community, rarely speak of Father Corbeau or the events at Saint Augustin Chapel. It remains a source of shame and trauma, a dark chapter that families would prefer to forget. Yet the story persists, passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and unchecked authority. In recent years, there have been efforts to locate and properly memorialize all of Father Corbeau's victims. A small monument now stands in the cemetery at Thibodaux, Louisiana, bearing the names of the 7 identified women and including a plaque that reads, "In memory of those whose lives were taken by one who betrayed the trust of God and community, may they rest in peace, and may their stories serve as a reminder of the vigilance we owe to the vulnerable among us." But for some, even this memorial is insufficient. There are those who believe that until all of Father Corbeau's victims are identified and honored, until the full truth of what happened in that underground chamber is known and acknowledged, the dead will not truly rest. They point to reports, still occasionally heard, of strange occurrences near the site of the demolished chapel. Lights seen moving through the swamp at night, the sound of bells ringing where no bells exist, the figure of a man in priestly vestments, glimpsed briefly before vanishing into the mist. Are these merely the products of overactive imaginations, shaped by knowledge of the horrors that occurred in that place? Or is there something more, some lingering presence that refuses to depart? Those who have experienced these phenomena remain convinced that Marais Noir is haunted, not by Father Corbeau himself, but by the souls of his victims, still seeking justice or perhaps simply acknowledgement of their suffering. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened beneath Saint Augustin Chapel. The full extent of Father Matthias Corbeau's crimes may never be known. His journals, while detailed, were not comprehensive. His death prevented any complete confession. And the swamps of Louisiana, which witnessed his actions, keep their secrets well. What we do know is this: between 1873 and 1891, in one of the most remote corners of America, a trusted spiritual leader betrayed that trust in the most profound way imaginable. He transformed a place of worship into a tomb, sanctuary into sacrilege, and devotion into depravity. And the echoes of his crimes continue to resonate more than a century later in the dark waters and darker memories of the Louisiana Bayou. Now I turn to you, our community of listeners who have stayed with us through this journey into darkness. What do you believe happened at Saint Augustin Chapel? How many victims do you think there truly were? Was Father Corbeau insane, or was he fully aware of the evil he committed? And what responsibility does the Church bear for failing to prevent these crimes? Share your theories in the comments below. Your insights and perspectives are what make this community a place where we can confront the darkest chapters of history together. If you found this investigation compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. We delve into forgotten mysteries, buried secrets, and the stories that history would prefer to forget. Join our haunted community of truth seekers and help us shine light into the darkest corners of the past. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are not those of folklore and legend, but those who walk among us wearing the masks of respectability and trust. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop questioning. Thank you for watching.